I'm very excited to make this video because I'm legitimately asking a question to my audience and people I tentatively disagree with. I'm perfectly fine with being shown that what I'm defending here is false, so responses are very much welcome. The question is, does it matter if moral realism is false? I want to ask this question to both realists of atheist and theistic stripes because I've become increasingly convinced of a few things. Now, before everyone starts firing away in the comments or in response videos, I want you to hear me out. Let me get some clarifications and some preemptive arguments out of the gate. First, let's clear up the trivial response that I'm sure I'm still probably going to get. I do not mean this question in the trivial sense of, well, if moral realism false, then nothing matters. So of course it doesn't matter if it's false. Oh, yeah, no. So when I ask, does it matter if moral realism is false? I mean, would my day-to-day life change in any practical way if moral realism was false? The more I think about it, I honestly don't think it would. I'm open to the idea that I'm wrong here, and that's actually a large motivation for why I'm making this video. Another clarification I have is that while I've become increasingly convinced that moral realism is false, I don't think it's false because I'm an atheist. Even if I were convinced that moral realism is true, which might happen as a result of this, I'd still be an atheist. There are atheist-compatible moral realist positions. Moral non-naturalism and Platonism are two options I know have very capable defenders in the current philosophical literature. I do think non-naturalism is probably the most plausible of the two, at least for me. If I wanted to go that way, I just think the non-realist thing better describes what we see in the world around us. The point is that there are options out there, so this is not a thing tied to my atheism. The third clarification that is very critical is the fact that I think if moral realism is false, then it's not true that I'd be committed to saying that there's, say, nothing wrong with insert moral atrocity here, like torturing babies for fun or the Holocaust or whatever. So when I say I think moral realism is false, what I mean is that moral values and duties don't have the same ontological status as, say, a chair or a planet. Um, I also don't think that they are necessary truths that must obtain in all possible worlds. But do those things mean that there's really nothing really wrong with whatever moral atrocity example we can come up with? Or that full-blown moral relativism is true and that I can just decide, well, murder's permissible for me today, right? I don't think so. I think taking I think what I'm doing is I'm taking moral realists at their word when they say that if morality is just a biological adaptation of our species that we use to govern social interactions, well, then that's not realism. What I'm asking is for realists to think about what it means if that's all morality really was. It would mean that we arrived at a set of rules that following and enforcing in our species has allowed us to survive and reproduce. In order to be selected for as an adaptation of evolution, for us to have these moral intuitions, this kind of herd morality has to have actual effects that benefit our specific species. And what we're left with is a kind of species relativism. So it's wrong for a human to rape, but it's not for a shark to forcibly copulate. This means that the sort of full-blown moral relativism is false. No human being gets to decide, well, murder is permissible for me today, because we just don't have that kind of control over our species-based moral system. And this is where I think realists misrepresent non-realists when they claim that on non-realism there's nothing really wrong with pick an atrocity. It's not that there's nothing wrong, it's just that the wrongness of the action would just mean that it violates the rules our species adapted. Human beings are still very much subject to moral rules, albeit the list of those rules likely gets pared down to some very basic concepts at their core, but we're still subject to them all the same. A human being can no more rid themselves of a social obligation to follow these rules as members of a social species than we can decide that we wish to fly instead of walk as our primary method of unaided transportation. I think an analogy works well here. As a human being, we find certain smells or tastes to be repulsive as a function of our biological evolution. A rotting carcass is something that will repel just about every human that has a functioning sense of smell. In the same way, we are just drawn to love our kin and are repelled by the idea of suffering pain, at least not without having good reason to. In short, we need other people, and morality is the social function that lets us to continue to interact with other people. Now, I want to address what I think is going to be the most common response, that if moral realism is false, then I have no basis to condemn things that others do that I find morally repulsive. I think non-realists have just as good a ground to condemn behavior as moral realists, and I'm going to try to explain how. I've already kind of established that if moral rules are a product of evolution, then those social behaviors and conditioning served a physical purpose in helping us survive and reproduce, what we call a herd morality. These basic principles and intuitions that were selected for are as objective a fact as the height of Mount Everest is above sea level. It's also just as contingent a fact. I don't think that matters. So, if I condemn another society for stoning women for adultery, as a non-realist, I'm just saying I think that practice is not in line with the principles selected for as part of our evolution, that if it was done widely, our species would not be as healthy as it otherwise would be. We would see this play out in comparison between cultures that do that regularly versus not. In this way, I could get some kind of firmer non-realism because people have an intersubjective desire to see our species flourish based on the kind of hardwired desires that evolution built into our species, namely to survive and reproduce. It just so happens that to do that effectively, we need to be part of a society, and so we basically need other people. Now, if all that's the case, then I don't see how my life changes in any practical way. I still justify my moral intuitions that say murder is wrong because if we just allowed murder whenever one desired, I couldn't have a strong expectation for the safety of myself and my family. I would still be subject to the moral enforcement mechanisms, which is basically society banding together in a larger group to act collectively to police moral transgressions. We do this at the social level for smaller infractions and at the harsher collective level for more serious infractions. So I can kind of already hear the objection I think I'm going to get, which is that on this kind of intersubjective non-realism, then if the Nazis had won World War II, then the Holocaust would have been permissible. I don't think that follows, because at worst, it means that the Nazis would have gotten away with it. But genocide is still wrong because it is wrong to just kill other people for innate properties that they can't control, right? So the Nazis were operating on a bunch of false premises, namely that the Jews weren't fully human, or and that also that the Jews were responsible for all the social problems that they had in Germany at the time. The issue is that in this ideology, if continued, becomes a larger problem for society. The concept of race, like that, and the mixing of people means that eventually very few are ever really safe from being called Jewish because of whatever in their lineages or whatever their lineages was. So, and I actually even saw that in Nazi Germany, right? They would just, if you fell out of favor with the regime, they'd accuse you of being Jewish and they'd have cook up some random great grandparent or something that was Jewish, and off to the camps you went. And then the other problem is that um, you don't know if your subgroup would actually be safe because if the Jews weren't actually responsible for the problems in society and they're just a scapegoat, well, once you've killed all the scapegoats and the problems remain, a new scapegoat has to be found. So, in fact, we don't even have to go to something as extreme as the Holocaust to see the problem here. We could look at where ethnic cleansings and genocides were successful, uncomfortably so. Look at the colonization of many modern countries, the US, Canada, Mexico, China. Honestly, if you go back far enough, basically everyone on the planet was subject to conquest and assimilation. This is the harsh pill that I think everyone is forced to swallow in this life. Sometimes people can violate the rules that govern society and get away with it. Sometimes they can even prosper in spite of it. But eventually, those violations have to stop in order for society to continue functioning. Now, perhaps one might say that if I acknowledge this non-realism, then maybe I have less reason to be moral, knowing that I could get away with being inconsistent with the moral code society needs to function. Now, I don't think that works because I can't guarantee that I will get away with any given infraction, and the risks largely outweigh the benefits I'd see for most serious violations. In fact, I'd argue that people actually do violate the moral code in small ways when they think they can get away with it and will only suffer minor consequences if they get caught. Speeding would be like the penultimate example here. But this problem isn't unique to non-realism because the moral enforcement mechanism we have in this world is entirely fallible. Ultimately, we band together in groups and decide on which moral violations are egregious enough to act on and where we as a group will enforce those norms through violence. The problem is, it doesn't matter if those norms are based on a realist view or a non-realist one, where we're just trying to act in accord with the minimal rules evolution selected for our species. Moral disagreement and enforcement of rules that are false by necessity happens all the time because different societies enforce contradictory moral rules. Consider the case of stoning women for adultery. In some interpretations of various religions, it's morally obligatory to do that. On other interpretations of the same or even different religions, it's an abomination. Yet this disagreement happens entirely between moral realists using the exact same meta-ethical theory, modified divine command theory. Those people just disagree about either what God commanded or which God was real, and so what commands are made up versus what's actually commanded. And if you look at religious epistemology, we will find that just about every view has a subjective component to it, so that individuals are rational in holding to their religious beliefs despite religious disagreement. So, in this way, a kind of moral subjectivism we find in enforcement comes for all of us, both realist and non-realist alike. So, to wrap this up, I think that the problems that are normally thrown at non-realists end up applying to realists, practically speaking. As such, I don't see how the issue makes any real difference to my life here and now. If moral realism is false, I still have all the same kinds of desires for myself, my family, my society, and all the same reasons, both practical and quote unquote moral, where morality is just the mechanism I'm subject to in order to interact with my social species. Again, I'm kind of just laying this out like how I see it, but given how many people react so negatively to non-realism, I'm kind of left wondering what I'm not seeing. Hence why I'm making this video. I'm happy to be shown that I'm wrong about this, though I currently don't particularly think it matters very much. As I've said, I think there are plenty of realist options I could choose from as an atheist. I just don't really see much reason to adopt one. In fact, I could go on about how I think things like moral progress actually makes a little bit more sense in the kind of non-realism I'm espousing, but I think I've gone on long enough. I honestly look forward to the responses, so thank you very much for watching. Take care.